us begin. Let us begin. What a beautiful day. Sunshine, blue sky, smiles, sparkles inside of your soul. It's a sad moment to bring this class to an end today. I don't know about you, but every Thursday at 1 o'clock, I know I'm going to have a good time. That's just the way it has been. And to be able to spend time with my dear brother Roberto. I know I've gone on, and he's a very, very shy brother, but I don't care. He's an international treasure, intellectually, morally, most importantly, courageously linked to the life of the mind and the betterment of the world. And so each time we have our last class, he and I, in some way, are in a down mood because we know we have to wait next year to teach together again. Now, we will not be teaching American democracy next year. We're going to teach conduct of life. And so that's going to be a wonderful shift. We get a chance to read a lot of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche and Emerson and a whole host of towering figures wrestling with death and dread and despair and disappointment and despondency. That's the good stuff. The very, very good stuff. For me also, it's a very, very sad day because yesterday was the death of Martin Luther Kilson, Jr., who was my dear friend. He was my mentor. I would not be sitting here if it were not for Martin Luther Kilson, Jr. He was the first professor, black professor, tenured in the history of Harvard. You think about that. 1969, Harvard was founded when? 1636. Ooh, what a long legacy of white supremacy at work. But Martin Kilson was tenured in 1969, and I met him when I was 17 years old. And he did what loving people do to young people. He believed in me. Convinced me to believe in myself in a way that I could not conceive of. Invited me to his office, invited me to his house, invited me to his country house. I didn't have any experiences of that, and I had never eaten Chinese food before until I ate food with Brother Martin and Marion and the precious children. But he's 88 years old. He grew up in Ambler, Pennsylvania. Went to Lincoln University, right down the street from Princeton, close friends with the great Horace Mann Bond, who was the president, who was the father of Julian Bond, himself an exemplary freedom fighter. Albert Einstein would always visit every year, drive down from Princeton to Lincoln University. Martin Kilson was close to Albert Einstein as well as Horace Mann Bond. He arrived here in 1953. Now, can you imagine that, being a black man at Harvard in 1953? It's hard enough being a black person in 2019. But 1953, he arrives with a smile, very equipped from his own family, Martin Luther King Sr., who was a AME minister in Ambler, Pennsylvania. And Martin Kilson goes on to become a towering intellectual figure. And when I got the call yesterday, it just hit me. It hit me so hard that I was going to take a good while to get over it. He was deeply concerned with issues of American democracy. He was in the government department. He wrote on Sierra Leone and Africa. He wrote on Afro-American politics. He wrote a magnificent autobiography. It's going to be one of the finest autobiographies of any black intellectual, in many ways an American intellectual. So just remember that name, Martin Kilson, K-I-L-S-O-N. I would hope that we would never forget him. One of the challenges of this class, of course, is trying to come to terms with all of the various components and parts of American civilization, American empire, American democracy, being able to think all three simultaneously. There once was a time in the history of the academy, both here and other parts of the country, where you could teach a course or take a course on American civilization. And you would read some of the figures that we've read in this class. You'd read Alexis de Tocqueville. You'd read Harriet Martineau. You would read the great Max Eastman. You would read Perry Miller, F.O. Matheson. All of these were towering figures, but he had a sense of America in its totality. As the academy became more professionalized and specialized and commodified and rationalized in terms of being bureaucratized, it's very difficult to get a sense of America as a whole. That we have magnificent scholars who can polish the nuts in the forest, but rarely give us a sense of what the forest looks like as a whole. I made the reference to this notion of synecdoche in regard to our dear brother Michael Lynn, who has a sense of the whole. That's what we liked about his work and his presentation. But I think in many ways it disarms students not to be able to see the connection between the development of U.S. nation state, the development of the U.S. economy, the development of the U.S. culture, the development of various ways in which individualism and individuality are constructed and changing over time, the relation between the U.S. as a nation and empire and other nations. That's larger context. And I hope that you all were able to try to get a sense of that in this class. Now, it's true that we have been fundamentally concerned about trying to put forward a particular set of arguments about alternatives to American democracy, but we've come back over and over again to the relation between statecraft and soulcraft, the relation between the social and what I'd call the spiritual, the relation between the economic and the existential, to think these things together, interrelated and interdependent. And you have been so blessed, of course, to have Brother Brady and Brother Stephan. Let's just give it up for these two. They have been magnificent. Oh, indeed, indeed. Very, very much so. And you can imagine how difficult it is to be a teaching fellow in this class. It's true. It's a challenge. You know, you're not just falling back on the more ordinary protocol of the profession. They've had to be improvisational on their feet, the way we oftentimes have aspired to be jazz-like as we sit behind the table. And by jazz-like, what I mean are three things. It has everything to do with what the Greeks call paideia, P-A-I-D-E-I-A, that deep education. We're not interested in just skill acquisition and information in this class. We're interested in looking at American democracy and concerned with alternatives. The time to grasp it as a dynamic phenomena, generating possibilities. And so that has to do with not just information, but transformation, imagination, trying to somehow discern imminent tendencies in the present that can be actualized and realized for a better future. And of course, that better future is predicated on an interpretation of the past. So all three dimensions of time, past, present, and future, thought simultaneously. So the first thing that we've tried to do is to engage in a formation of wise attention. Oftentimes people talk about American democracy, we are tending to the wrong things. You attend to various statistics. Or you talk about race, you attend to achievement gaps. Oh, how impoverished a discourse if you really want to get at the precious young people who are undergoing forms of education, trying to allow their lives to flower and flourish, you see. But we were concerned about what? Trying to get us to attend to American democracy as a series of power struggles, a series of clashes of consciousness, which is clashes of self-conceptions, clashes of self-understandings. So we're not simply crude Machiavellians. The history of American democracy is not just the clash of interests, but rather human beings with interests who have conceptions of themselves, who have not just consciousness, but consciousness. And the ways in which you can pique that consciousness, the ways in which you can shape and touch people's hearts and souls, and yet there's structures, there are institutions in place. And it's very, very difficult to think over against those structures and institutions. That's why we had a very Socratic impulse in this class, which is to cultivate critical consciousness. And never confuse criticism with skepticism. Criticism is itself always skeptical of skepticism, because skepticism usually presupposes the viewpoint of a spectator, whereas criticism is participatory. You gotta be self-involved. You gotta be self-invested. That's why this class, again, was not a matter of just looking at a spectacle of two brothers going at it. No, not at all. You had to leave thinking, where do I stand? What do I think? It's the difference between Cicero and Demosthenes. People used to go hear Cicero speak and they say, oh my God, he's so brilliant. He's just so overwhelming with his words. A spectacle to Cicero. But they hear Demosthenes speak and they say, it's time to march. It's time to do something. It's time to change my life. That's a qualitative difference. You all see the difference I'm talking about? And in a culture of superficial spectacle, we are encouraged to be spectators. Even in our educational process, encouraged to be spectators. Don't put yourself on the line. Just like we refuse to not put ourselves on the line in terms of this is what we believe. We could have had some interesting close readings of de Tocqueville and made you all think, ooh, they're such informed professors. Look at all of those rich footnotes. We say, no, de Tocqueville is a launching pad among many. But come go with us, like George Clinton on the mothership. Embark on this journey with us. We've got an argument to unfold. We've got interpretations to put forward. Cultivation of critical consciousness. And then last but not least is the attempt to engage in a maturation of a courageous soul. And this is so very important. It's so very important because three of the major impediments in American intellectual life, and especially in the academy, including our beloved Harvard University and all of its faults and foibles and all of its joys, is conformity, complacency, and cowardliness. See, that's precisely what professionalism at its worst generates in the shaping of students on the way to career. You see, you can't wait to conform, complicit to the misery outside of your manicured, deodorized context. And then when it's time to be tested, to take a stand of where you really think and act, there's too much cowardliness. Too much cowardliness. Too many people are just scared because their careers are at stake, because they're perceived in a certain way, because they don't believe enough in themselves. Now, granted, I'm not talking about anybody in this room, but when it comes to our other fellow brothers and sisters at Harvard, they've got some challenges. And so we proceed as our dear black sister Mary Ellen Pleasant did, the first black woman millionaire in the history of the American empire, who gave John Brown $800,000 in 1851. She was called the mother of human rights in California. She was a domestic maid who happened to marry a robber baron, and he dropped dead. She didn't kill him, but he dropped dead. And she inherited millions of dollars. Mary Ellen Pleasant. This is before the great Madam C.J. Walker, who made her money on her own, out of Indianapolis. And she used to begin every lecture, "I'd rather be a corpse than a coward." Intellectual courage, moral courage, existential spiritual courage, but that courage going hand in hand with humility, always the benchmark of moral and spiritual maturity. Not arrogance, not condescension, not haughtiness, not looking down on others, reinforcing one's own insecurity because you're so smart and the people don't acknowledge you're so smart, you're going to really convince them that you're so smart. Ooh, you remain in perpetual audition your whole life. But no, humility tied to intellectual moral tenacity, what it means to be an intellectual warrior. That's what Brother Roberto's been for over 50 years. An intellectual warrior. He might not look like that sometimes, but this brother is in the vanguard of what it means to be on the battlefield, to be dramatic in the way you think. And you remember, drama is always about conflict, emotionally felt and critically reflected upon. And all of the great intellectuals, as opposed to the academicians, are dramatic thinkers. Showing you contrast, conflict, juxtaposition, so that you're able to connect yourself in that drama, just like a grand novel by Stendhal or Flaubert or Richard Wright or Toni Morrison. Kafka is a larger issue and a deeper challenge, but the same wrestling with what it means to be a participant, courageous, visionary, thinking for yourself, never imitating, not looking at yourself through the lens of others. And American democracy, nation state, political economy, culture, self-formation, has everything to do with either cultivating the kinds of virtues and qualities I've talked about, or in the end, the greed, the hatred, the resentment, the envy will undercut the prospect of American democracy. That's what Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel meant when he stood in Riverside Church on April 4th, 1967. And he said, the future of America depends on the impact and influence of Martin Luther King Jr. And he was not talking about an individual. He was talking about forms of virtue and value and vision enacted by this particular person in light of larger traditions that inform him. And it's not confined to the chocolate side of town, even though Martin Luther King Jr. emerges from that part of town. It has to do with the nation. It has to do with the willingness to attend to certain issues, usually overlooked, downplayed. Empire, white supremacy, issues of class. Do we have what it takes? That's the question we always end every class with, you see. And it's an open question. Every generation has to answer that for themselves. Every person has to answer that for themselves. Just like your fingerprint, that's just yours. Your answer, the life that you live, is just yours. What will it be? It will be like the conclusion of a practical Aristotelian syllogism, which is not a proposition, but a life lived. Action taken, praxis enacted. And that's why this class ends very much like what Socrates represents at his best, or what the prophetic legacy of Jerusalem represents at its best, the Esthers, the Amoses, the Jesuses, the Mohammeds, or the best of the secular traditions. Those who tried to think for themselves were thoroughly convinced that if they could shatter the conformity, the complacency, and the cowardliness, and generate enough citizens to try to renew and regenerate American democracy, and to do it in such a way that it has impact not just here, but around the world. Let me stop there, my brother.
Yes. So I will continue Cornell's remarks by attempting to reflect on some of the central themes of our course, and in the hope of reminding you of the scope and direction of our project here. So the first theme, and the theme with which we began the course, was the theme of the message of the American prophets. And the extent to which this message continues to be powerful and to deserve its potency, but at the same time requires criticism and correction. And as I presented it in our very first class, the core of the message of the American prophets is the idea of our share in the divine spark, in the divine attribute of transcendence, that there is more in each of us and in all of us collectively, the human race, than there is or ever can be in the social and cultural worlds that we build and inhabit. They are finite in relation to us, and we are infinite in relation to them. And the message then is the message that we can become greater together, that we can enjoy, all of us, ordinary men and women, an ascent to a higher form of life with greater scope, greater intensity, and greater capability. And I argued then at the beginning of our exploration that this message suffered from the outset from a double taint in its characteristic and most influential formulations. It suffered from an inadequate recognition of the role that solidarity plays in self-construction. And it suffered as well from the temptation to succumb to an institutional idolatry, to the belief that the country discovered at the time of its foundation the definitive formula of a free society. And this formula would have only to be adjusted at the margin from time to time under the provocation of crisis. So on this view, it is not enough to implement the message. It is necessary as well to correct the message in the course of its implementation. Now, a second recurrent theme in the arguments of the course is the theme of the distinctive character of the United States. The American exceptionalism writ small. Not the idea that the United States is radically different from all other countries, but that it has distinctive characteristics on a spectrum. And there is this remarkable circumstance that the country that has now, for over 100 years, been the most influential in the world and the most powerful, is an outlier on a series of spectrums with regard to class structure, and its relation to race, with regard to institutions and the attitude to institutions, and with regard to consciousness. And this has been a distinct source of trouble and confusion in the relation of the rest of the world to the United States. Virtues and defects of humanity, our strengths and weaknesses, are widely distributed among the nations. No nation is better than any other nation. And I have participated in this argument as an outsider, viewing the American experiment with sympathy, but also critically. And there is implicit in my arguments a certain form of moral judgment that I do want to make explicit. So I see the characteristic qualities of the American people as their energy, their ingenuity, their vitality, their good faith, and their recognition of our share in this divine attribute and of our ability to extend our share. Their characteristic defects are their failure to recognize adequately the claims of solidarity in the project of self-construction. Their tendency to submit to this idolatry of their institutional arrangements, their exaggeration of the extent to which the individual can save himself, and their understatement of the extent to which society can be transformed. And in all these respects, their lack of imagination. Now, the third theme in our arguments in the course has been the way in which the prophetic message, corrected in the process of being implemented, now requires, in the present historical circumstance, an agenda of structural change, meaning change in the formative institutional arrangements of the country and in the dominant forms of consciousness, of sensibility, both. And we have explored some of the main elements of such an agenda in the present circumstance. So one element is the democratizing of the market order. And it, in turn, has, among other components, the following three. The overcoming of the abyss that has now opened up between the advanced and backward parts of production, and that is manifest in the insular and exclusive character of the new, most advanced practice of production, the knowledge economy. The transformation of the relation between labor and capital, so that in the short term, an increasing part of the labor force ceases to be condemned to precarious, insecure employment. And so that in the long term, the higher forms of free labor, self-employment, and cooperation come to prevail over the inferior form, economically dependent wage labor. And the reshaping of the relation between finance and production, so that finance, rather than being allowed to serve itself, is made to serve the productive agenda of society and transformed into a good servant rather than being allowed to remain or to become a bad master. The second axis of such a structural alternative is a radical change in the character of education. A form of education for everyone, not just for an elite, that privileges the analytic and synthetic capabilities of the mind, that prefers selective depth to encyclopedic superficiality, that affirms the preference for cooperation over the juxtaposition of individualism and authoritarianism, and that approaches every subject dialectically from contrasting points of view. And the third axis is the axis of the deepening of democracy, the creation of a high-energy democracy that elevates the temperature of politics, the level of organized popular engagement in political life, that hastens the pace of politics through the development of constitutional mechanisms for the rapid resolution of impasse, and that taps the experimentalist potential of a federal regime to combine strong central initiative with divergence, dissidence, and experiment in parts of the country. Such a democracy diminishes the dependence of change on crisis and overthrows the rule of the living by the dead. Now then, the fourth theme of the course has been our exploration of certain episodes or turning points in American history as offering models or counter-models, sources of insight for such a project today. On the one hand, we have suggested that the dominant reform traditions in American history, the tradition of the defense of the small against the big, small property and small business against big property and big business, and the opposing tradition of accepting the predominance of big business at the commanding heights of the economy, but subjecting it to strong regulation by national government, are both inadequate to fulfill the task of today. And both share a kind of reification of the market order, a view that the market order has a single natural and necessary legal and institutional content. In search of alternatives to this view, we examined other moments in American history. We discussed the New Deal, which was the last great moment of institutional and ideological refoundation in the United States. Its positive side, its early institutional experimentalism, but also its limitations. Its subordination of the democratization of opportunities and capabilities to the single-minded focus on the restabilization of the economy, managed competition, and then later the narrowing of its focus to the provision of safeguards against economic insecurity. It is one thing to treat the provision of such antidotes to insecurity, protection, as a shield, as an end in itself, and another thing to treat it as the preliminary to an expansion of opportunities and capabilities that throws the social and economic world open to a more radical plasticity. And then we went further back in American history to the first half of the 19th century and discussed there the combination that existed in the early life of the Republic between the mobilization of national resources on top by the national government, and the selective democratization of the then crucial sectors of the economy, agriculture and finance, and attributed to this interplay a large part of the strength of the United States in its early period, coexisting with the terrible incubus of African slavery. But this virtuous dialectic seems to have been successively weakened later in the history of the American Republic by two forces, one political and the other intellectual. The political one was the weakness of democracy, the proto-democratic liberalism enshrined in the American constitutional arrangements, a weakness of democracy that allowed there to be a condominium of high finance with big business under the eyes of the government. And the other constraining force was the force of ideas, or rather of the lack of ideas, the predominance of ideas that naturalized the established form of the market order and of democratic politics, and legitimated the institutional idolatry to which the Americans were already inclined. Now then, the fifth theme of the course, underlying these programmatic and historical arguments, and never fully made explicit in our arguments here, is a certain attitude, a certain view of the established ideological debate, not just in the United States, but in the whole world. The predominant form of the ideological debate has been a contest between what you could describe as shallow freedom and shallow equality. On this view, the right are those who give priority to freedom against the background of the established institutional arrangements of the economy and of politics. And the left are those who give priority to equality against the background of those same arrangements. So shallowness means acceptance of the institutional presuppositions and of the ideological assumptions with which they are associated. And another common feature of the opposing positions in this debate could be described as the idea that littleness is natural, that the life of the ordinary person would be so confined and disempowered is somehow just the way things are. Now, against this view of the ideological debate and of its potential, we have explicitly or implicitly affirmed another view. And the other view requires that we relax this constraint that I label shallowness and admit that the background institutional arrangements can and should be reshaped. Not all at once in some big systemic movement, but in a form that is fragmentary but can nevertheless become cumulative, and by being cumulative, have in the future a radical outcome. And that view, that attitude to structural change, assumes a rejection of what you could describe as the binary view of politics, which comes from Marxism and other classical social theories. Namely, the view that there are basically two kinds of politics. There's the revolutionary substitution of one system by another, or there's the reformist management of a system, associating gradualism with superficiality and radical intention with total change. And we have here proposed to jumble these cards and to reject this binary view. But the change of the method is associated with a reinterpretation of the goal. What should distinguish the progressives or the left in this altered vision of the debate? Not what you could call deep equality, which is the insistence on a rigid equality of outcome or circumstance. Entrenched or radical inequality is unacceptable. It results in subjugation. But the higher goal is not a rigid equality of circumstance. The higher goal is what we could describe as deep freedom. What replaces shallow equality in this conception of the progressive project is deep freedom. Deep freedom understood as this ascent of the ordinary person to a higher form of existence with greater capability, power, and scope. And the struggle against inequality is subsidiary to that larger goal, is only an aspect of it. Now then, finally, the sixth theme of the course, also largely implicit, but from time to time in our arguments and in our conversations with our guests made explicit, is a view of the historical moment, of the circumstance in which we are having these arguments. And this circumstance can be described close up or from further away in a world historical perspective. So close up, the circumstance is this. The dominant political economic consensus of the late 20th century, not just in the United States, but in the rich North Atlantic democracies generally, which is a combination, a marriage of neoliberalism and institutionally conservative social democracy, has failed. It failed unequivocally. It failed to sustain economic growth. It failed to avoid the aggravation of inequality. It embarked on a form of globalization that helped savage internal social compacts. And its favored devices, such as the liberalization or flexibilization of labor markets, only increased economic insecurity without sustaining economic growth. So the project was this project of combining the economic flexibility of the Americans with the social protection of the Europeans, of making classical liberalism more social and making social democracy more liberal. It's that project that failed. It retains its prestige as an ideological discourse, but it was unable to do its historical work. And the immediate sequel to its failure is then the rise of right-wing populism, as we sometimes call it, which, despite its apparent success in many countries, including the United States, is itself fragile. It has no institutional model of its own, nor even any strategy of broad-based economic growth. Its characteristic measures are entirely defensive: restraints on migration, subsidies, limitations to offshoring. To what end? To the end of buying a few more years for a form of production that has no future. So we could see it as a kind of suspended animation, as the perpetuation of a vacuum, and therefore a tremendous opportunity for the emergence of an alternative if there were one. That then is the description of the moment. That's the situation that commands our attention and our focus in these arguments. Now let me step back and describe the circumstance of our argument from a wider perspective, a world historical perspective in a greater horizon of time. For the last more than 200 years, the whole world has been set on fire by a revolutionary project. And the United States has played a role in the formulation and worldwide dissemination of that project. The project always had two sides. One side political, and the other side personalist. The political side was carried by the doctrines of liberalism, socialism, democracy to the whole world in a campaign of delegitimation and subversion of entrenched forms of social division and hierarchy. And the personalist side has been carried, above all, by the worldwide popular romantic culture of the movies, of the soap operas, of popular music, with its message, formulaic and sentimental in the characteristic expressions, but incendiary nevertheless, that the ordinary man and woman looked up close is not so ordinary after all, and has this uncreated divine spark.
Yes, yes, yes.
And this vocation to increase his or her share in this divine attribute of transcendence. That project has been for a long time and continues to be the most powerful project in the world. It has enemies, but all of its enemies in the world respond to it. And in that sense, it continues to command the agenda of humanity. But although it remains the strongest project, it is at the same time now, in a sense, weak. It is weak because its votaries no longer know what its next step should be. Either on the political side or on the personal side. The law of the spirit is that we can preserve only what we renounce and recreate. And we can make this project live and make this revolution continue only if we reinvent it in some other form. And the reinvention must take the form of the definition of the next steps. So our lives, of all of us here, happen to have fallen in a counter-revolutionary interlude in this long revolutionary period in the history of humanity. And the question for each of us is whether we will allow our beliefs, attitudes, and actions to be shaped by the circumstances and biases of the counter-revolutionary interlude. And that's another way of thinking of the context in which this argument takes place. From the beginning to the end, from the first theme to the last, the central idea remains. This idea that we become more human by becoming more godlike. This is the revolutionary idea. And every empire, every power, every interest, every dogma that opposes it will be brought down into the dust.
Beautiful, brother. Beautiful. Let's just let it sink in for a while. Questions, queries?
So we should have a conversation now, not about what I just said, but about the general themes of the course. And
That includes
our
what
project,
you just said.
of course, it's just an interpretation.
That still includes what you just
An
said.
interpretation
That's right.
of what
Absolutely.
we've tried to do here.
Indeed, indeed. Questions? Yes, dear brother.
You gave,
Speak up, we can hear your wonderful voice, man.
Professor Unger gave the example of family farms and local banks, the regulated interstate banks, as examples of historical democratization of the markets. What would be like something that you would see happening now that would do that?
Well, just to follow up on that example, we did discuss, albeit briefly, what would be required for the deepening and dissemination of the knowledge economy beyond the fringes to which it is now confined. So the very first steps, as beginning modestly in this spirit of a gradualism with radical intentions, would be everything that we could do to lift up the vast periphery of the economy, of the production system. So, for example, a counterpart, an industrial counterpart, or a services counterpart to the 19th century agricultural extension to which you just referred. Doing now, at the beginning of the 21st century, a counterpart to what the Americans did in the first half of the 19th century when they organized family-scale agriculture with entrepreneurial characteristics, based on decentralized strategic coordination between the government and the family farmer and cooperative competition among the family farmers. They invented a new kind of agricultural market. So it begins in very modest initiatives that would be the present day equivalents to that 19th century project. That's one way of thinking about it. But that's only, of course, only a small part of what would be involved. Because, for example, we need a different kind of education. We need an accumulation of forms of social capital, because we know that the knowledge economy thrives only against the background of the multiplication of forms of collective action that requires a circulation of people, ideas, practices, and resources in a whole small world of firms, and a fluid mixture of cooperation and competition. So at that point, the discussion devolves into these experiments and into the circumstantial judgment about where to begin. Because always what matters in the definition of a programmatic project is the marking of the direction and then the selection of the initial steps by which to begin to move in that direction. And the initial steps have to always combine two characteristics. On the one hand, they have to be useful to the direction. That is, they have to create a stage for the next step. And there's always this ambiguity in any project of reform, that every change we make can be a basis for not making the next change, a way of avoiding a more radical change, or it can be an intermediate link toward that next step. The second characteristic of these initial steps is that they can't be just instrumentally useful. They have to have some symbolic power. They have to be a kind of down payment on the future that is promised, so that even in an imperfect form, they prefigure the direction and make it tangible. And that's the characteristic of prophetic and transformative action in the world. The prophet has a vision, but the prophet puts his hand on the wound and provides a tangible prefigurement. of this vision of the transformed experience. So that's the kind of thing we would have to do, and we would do it in many domains, including the one you just mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Yes, in the back.
So there's a lot of movement right now with youth organizing for climate justice, and I'm wondering how you think that could shape American democracy in the next few decades, if we make it in the next few decades.
This is Heat Week, though, isn't it?
Yes.
Absolutely. No, I think that the kind of activism around ecological catastrophe around the corner is a marvelous manifestation of the increasing intellectual and moral awakening among young people. That's part of what I mean by the shattering of complacency, the willingness of young folk to be able to stand up and say and enact something that goes beyond their individual careers or goes beyond their egoistic inclinations or just narrow professional trajectories. So I think it's a magnificent thing, and I know what 4 years ago we almost shut Harvard down during that particular week. I was there in New Jersey, but I came up to be a part of the activity, and I think there's Bill McGibbon and others playing an important role, Naomi Klein and others. So I think it's a very important development. It's part of that critical consciousness and courageous witness that I was talking about, not in a self-righteous way, which is to say not to give attention to itself, but to be part of something bigger. I mean, part of the problem, I think, even among activists, is the tendency sometimes to view oneself more as a peacock displaying foliage as opposed to an eagle that can generate eggs, effects, consequences that connects us presently to the future, tied to an alternative, a better alternative to the present. But that's part of the cultural spectacle too. I mean, that's part of the excitement in some ways of our dear sister Beyonce. Beyonce in many ways is the symbol of the culture of spectacle. But in the homecoming, she decides to bring her own rich tradition into it. I'm not coming by myself in an isolated way. Come on, y'all. Let's do it together. Let's be connected to institutional reform as it relates to historically black institutions. Let's invoke the Nina Simones and the Audre Lordes and the Toni Morrisons and so forth. And so there's a kind of zeitgeist shift that's taking place, because if the greatest entertainer, with all of her genius and talent, can try to engage in that kind of shift, don't view me as the successful individual. View me as a wave in an ocean. So when you see them blowing the trumpet and moving in ways that you wish you could move like, that's a tradition. And it's not just entertainment. That movement is based on struggling with suffering, wounds and bruises and scars and so forth, and then being able to do what? What we've talked about in this class in terms of kenosis. To empty oneself, to give oneself, to donate oneself as individuals in community. I know this is a close reading of Homecoming, and I'm not advertising the film, you know. But it hit me very hard in terms. Same was true with Amazing Grace with Aretha. You ought to just see both of those the same day, and you'll be a different person. That's how deep it cuts. But it's related to what it means to sustain spirit, soul at the level of existential issues connected to the looking for alternatives, structurally, institutionally, as well as psychically, culturally, personally. With other questions? Yes, our dear sister right there.
Following up last question, I am an organizer for the Harvard Prison Divestment Campaign and following the racialized criticism.
Louder, please.
And following the racialized criticism that we have received after our demonstrations, how do you imagine the dichotomy between civil discourse, civil disobedience, and protests, and grassroots activism, all of that fitting
And directed more at me than Brother Roberto, you think? Yeah, absolutely. Well, one, of course, I want to salute you. I'm a part of that investment move, disinvestment movement too, and honored to be a part of it from the faculty point of view. And I think it's part of that same moral and spiritual awakening that I'm talking about. I was very, very encouraged to see the brothers and sisters of all colors in the fossil fuel disinvestment movement coming together with the prison disinvestment movement, because there's strength in that kind of unity and solidarity. But it's always, again, got to be tied to what the larger interest, what the larger good is. And there's no doubt that it isn't very important in public spaces to allow people's voices to be heard and mediated with respect. But you try to exhaust all of the possibilities for that kind of public dialogue. And if you exhaust all of those possibilities, then you do explore other forms of civil disobedience. You see, so I'm not dogmatic about that, but the question is trying to make sure we explore all of those, but also understand, what we're up against. I mean, I think I've made this point over and over again, that Harvard has never and will probably never be on the cutting edge of social justice for poor people. It's not that kind of institution. You know what I mean? It's like asking our brothers and sisters in hockey to break dance every night. They're not going to do it. They can study MC Hammer all they want. They're not going to do it. It's not part of what goes into the making of Harvard to be fundamentally concerned about poor people. So that those who are have to be in Harvard but not of Harvard. And bring critique to bear of the dominant tendencies of Harvard. But it's not going to be a push button overnight transformation of Harvard, and then we get upset when they act the way they've acted since 1636. See what I mean? That doesn't mean progress can't be made. Doesn't mean breakthroughs can't be made. But we do have to understand the nature of institutions that engage in ruling class formations and the dominant tendencies. And we can be countervailing voices, countervailing movements, both within Harvard, but that's one of the reasons why it's very important that there be a town gown coming together, which is to say we've got to connect with social movements outside of Harvard, because it has been the social movements that are the ethical thermostats. Harvard's a thermometer. It just reflects what's out there. You got to bring Harvard kicking and screaming into struggles for justice. If we had waited for Harvard to be on the cutting edge of allowing women to gain access to equality, to this day it'd probably be all brothers. No, it was the feminist movement from the outside that brought pressure to bear. Same is true with the anti-white supremacist movement. It's movements from the outside that brought Harvard. Same will be true with workers' movement. Same is true with the unionization of workers within Harvard. See what I mean? And we have to be able to say that in such a way that we don't demonize the people we disagree with. You know, we can debate with Brother Larry, the President Bacow, and so forth and so on, put pressure on him, and allow his voice to be heard and acknowledging this context, but still letting him know very clearly that this pressure will be brought to bear, because there ought to be some kind of ethical element in investment decisions, even in an institution of higher learning that often is involved in ruling class formation for the empire as a whole. So that's the beginning of an answer to the question, but I salute the work that you all are trying to do. Yes, brother.
Dr. Weston, Mr. Hunter, this question is in the context of labor and inequitable distribution of wages thereof. And so to break apart this term of labor, I would consider Hannah Arendt's differentiation of work and labor. And there seems to be a incompatible dichotomy between the atomization of work and labor, where on the hand of our working for revenue in our jobs, we try to maximize the revenues of that work, whereas we try to minimize the expenses of then delegating our labor of living to someone in the service industry or someone not of that class of work. So in your thesis of reconciling the high technology economy with the, let's say, encumbrance of the last century kind of economy, how do we navigate this differentiation of work and labor for more equitable distribution of wages and a recognition those in the maintenance are just as much valuable for our society if they're not recognized for it as those at the cutting edge of work and revenue generating high-tech knowledge economies.
You want to begin?
No,
or
that's,
you
that's
want
your,
me to
yeah,
begin?
that's your, you can start with
So,
that. Appreciate that question.
It's part of the same debate, right? So there are basically two approaches that we can take. One approach is we can treat the structural changes in the economy as if they had an intrinsic logic that we are incapable of changing, and then attempt to correct the consequences after the fact through retrospective redistribution by progressive taxation and redistributive social entitlements. That turns out every time to be an inadequate response to the problem. Because if we do that, if we think in that way about this problem that you raise and about every problem like it, we find that we can't go very far in the retrospective redistribution of the inequalities generated by the market without beginning to disorganize the market and exacting an unacceptable economic cost. Because then we begin to derange the way that the established incentives to invest, save, and employ function. So that idea of the tension between retrospective correction and the economic result is captured in the traditional rhetoric of equity versus efficiency. That's what it means. So the most significant role of the corrective redistribution is not to moderate inequality. It can do that only to a very limited extent. Its most significant role is to do precisely what institutionally conservative social democracy achieved, despite its limitations, which is to sustain a high level of investment in people and in their capabilities, paradoxically financed, for the most part, by the regressive and indirect taxation of consumption. The priority has to be changing the arrangements that shape the original distribution of economic advantage and that change the economy on the supply side rather simply than dealing with the demand side of the economy, as the progressives usually have done. So on the whole, they have lacked a productivist project and a progressive approach to the supply side of the economy. And they've abandoned the supply side of the economy to the right. So a signal example of what it would mean to have a productivist project or a progressive approach to the supply side is to have a project for the deepening and dissemination of the knowledge economy. And that would be part of the answer to the problem that you evoke, that step by step in larger concentric circles, more and more of the production system would be brought closer to the vanguard. And there are then these three sets of requirements for that. There are educational requirements, there are social or moral requirements, forms of collective action, and there are above all legal and institutional requirements, successive steps of innovation in the legal and institutional architecture of the market economy, ending far in the future in the coexistence of alternative forms of property and contract, alternative contract and property regimes in the same market order. Market economy should not be fastened to a single dogmatic version of itself. It should be able to experiment about itself. And this has to happen in order to develop fully against the background of an experimentalist impulse in culture and of a high energy democracy, so that the state is not captured by narrow class interest. So that's the basic argument. But that argument with respect to the knowledge economy and its deepening and dissemination requires to be complemented by a series of other initiatives. And one of those other initiatives has to do with the relation between labor and capital. So the basis of the historical representation of labor and of the collective bargaining system was the hegemony of mass production. So its premise is that there'd be a large, stable labor force assembled in large productive units, such as factories, under the aegis of big corporations. Now, with a change in the practice of production, an increasing part of the labor force is organized on a global scale in the form of decentralized networks of contractual arrangements. And in that circumstance, a larger and larger percentage of the labor force is consigned to precarious employment. So then there are two positions in the traditional debate about labor and capital. One position is to say, we'll insist on the primacy of the classical form of the representation of labor, and we'll regard everything else as a fraudulent circumvention of the labor laws. And the other position is to say, no, they're new productive realities and they require flexibility. But then flexibility means, in practice, unless there is some form of countervailing power or some new legal regime, radical economic insecurity and precarious employment. That means then that if we regard these two traditional positions as inadequate, that we need to develop a third position. And the third position is, yes, there must be flexibility, but flexibility cannot be a free-for-all. We must create, alongside the traditional labor laws, a new body of rules. And that new body of rules must promote the organization and representation of the insecure workers, and to the extent that they are not adequately organized and represented, direct legal intervention in the employment relation to prevent flexibility from meaning insecurity and immiseration, the depression of the real wage. So, for example, the principle of price neutrality, that labor performed under conditions of temporary employment must be remunerated at least the same level of the equivalent labor performed under conditions of stable employment. And that's just an example of the development of a set of rules. So that would be what I would describe as a very early step in a progression. And then if we look further ahead in the progression, what do we want? In a more remote future, because we need to have a vision of the future to have a sense of the direction. So what we want is a world in which free labor becomes really free. And we have to then retake the idea that was universally shared by the 19th century liberals and socialists, that wage labor is an inferior form of free labor, retaining characteristics of serfdom and slavery. And it has to give way to the higher forms of free labor, which are self-employment and cooperation. Now, how could it do that? How could we make these higher forms of free labor compatible with the imperative of economies of scale? We'd need to have experiments in the property regime, so that there would be many different forms of decentralized access to productive resources and opportunities, and not just the one form of the unified absolute and eternal property right. So just as a thought experiment far in the future, you say, Society administers the productive resources that it has. Whoever can assure society of the highest rate of return for the use of those resources gets to use them temporarily. And we treat the traditional absolute unified property right as simply a limiting case. Now then there's a third dimension of this distant future. So the first dimension is the ascendancy of the higher forms of free labor. The second dimension is the diversification of the forms of decentralized access to productive resources and opportunities, to radicalize economic decentralization, to deepen the logic or genius of the market order, which is to be an organized anarchy. The third dimension is that we want to say that in the future, no human being should be condemned to do the work that can be done by a machine. The machine is to do everything that we've learned how to repeat, so that we can preserve our time for the not yet repeatable. And then this combination of the machine with the anti-machine, the human being, is much more powerful than either of them alone. So that's the direction. But we know that the direction is very distant. But then we deal with the immediate emergency, which is the rise of precarious employment, as an initial step toward this direction. And that's just an example of a different way of thinking in political economy. Because then we begin to open up a whole set of debates. And because you could make a list of like 100 debates, that would be just one of them. But each one of them we would approach in an analogous spirit.
Just very briefly, philosophically, though, I think the great Hannah Arendt can be deeply misleading. She's very rich, she's very profound. I'm thinking of The Human Condition, her classic, 1959. Because her conception of the public is primarily confined to the political. So she doesn't have a conception of the public and social life, the public and cultural life, the public and economic life. See, if you go to the trajectory of Karl Marx or John Dewey's great work of 1927, The Public and Its Problems, very, very different than Hannah Arendt. The great critique is Sheldon Wolin, who's my thesis advisor, who was the greatest radical theorist of democracy in the latter part of the 20th century. He wrote a powerful essay on Hannah Arendt's dramatological conception of the public. It goes back to the Greeks and the Greek polis. That was why when she argued in 1957 with the black students trying to gain access to Central High in Arkansas, she said the government has no right to defend those kids because they're in the social realm. She called it etiquette. And Ralph Waldo Ellison, the great novelist, came back with a critique of Hannah Arendt and said, there are publics in social life where the government can intervene. And so radical Democrats, from Marx to Dewey to Sheldon Wolin to Ralph Ellison, understand there's democratic energies in publics not confined to the nation state. But it's in
and not limited to politics.
And not limited to politics in that narrow sense. Absolutely. So we learn much from Hannah Arendt. Don't be misled by her genius. Geniuses have a way of misleading folk.
But let me just take off.
Even though we learn from them.
Let me take off from
Would you agree with what I just said,
Yes,
my brother?
I do.
That's good, that's good. We on the same wavelength, that's nice.
Yes, because and this is an important point about education.
Yes, absolutely.
So, you know, philosopher Schopenhauer makes this remark about the difference between a talented man and a genius. He said, a talented man is a marksman who hits a target that others cannot hit. A genius is a marksman who hits a target that others cannot see. So genius is not about facility, it's about vision.
Yes,
it's not a kind of super smartness.
That's right.
And we believe, we Democrats and experimentalists,
Radical Democrats.
that these prophetic powers, these powers of vision can be widely disseminated in humanity.
That's right.
And that's what we want. But I do want to elaborate further on these remarks that Cornell has just made about politics and Arendt, because they open up a discussion about that generalizes what we were just saying with respect to political economy. So, you know, the basis of this view of Arendt and others is the famous contrast made by the Swiss political theorist Benjamin Constant at the beginning of the 19th century. It's a contrast between what he called the ancient republic and the modern republic. So the modern republic is the form of political life in which what is dominant is the real flesh and bones, interest-bearing, interest-pursuing individual, for whom politics, in the narrow sense, is an exceptional or ecstatic activity. That individual is turned to the affairs of private life. The ancient republic was supposedly, so I say supposedly because it's a fantasy, the republic of the selfless citizen for whom the affairs of the republic were existentially central and everything else was peripheral. And the barrier between the private and public world did not exist or had been overthrown. Now, and that was supposedly ancient Sparta or ancient Rome, something not real. So what it is just the imaginary inversion of the contemporary, of the modern political experience, turning it on its head and imagining its negation, not as a real process of transformation. So in thinking about politics, the only possible point of departure is Benjamin Constant's modern republic. Now, in that modern republic, generalizing, you could say, the experience of the individual is that there are basically two classes of moves that we can make. There are the ordinary moves that we make within a framework of arrangements and assumptions that we take for granted. And then there are the exceptional moves by which, from time to time, under the pressure of crisis, we challenge and change pieces of the framework. So most of the time, the framework is not just unchallenged, but unseen. It's invisible. And that's then this experience of the modern republic. That's a form of disempowerment. Now, how do we achieve empowerment? We don't achieve empowerment through this imaginary inversion of the idea of the ancient republic. We achieve empowerment by gradually narrowing the distance between these two classes of moves. So we begin to reorganize our economic and political arrangements and our discourses and practices in such a way that the challenge and change of pieces of the framework becomes a more natural and continuous extension of the ordinary business of life. So then we can engage in the world without surrendering to it. And we can be, to a higher extent, insiders and outsiders at the same time. That's how we become free. We don't become free through this imaginary inversion. We become free through this progressive transformation. And the ideas of a democratized market economy through the generalization of the most advanced practice of production, which is the practice closest to the imagination, and of a high-energy democracy, are simply two variants of this same conception, of this conception of creating a structure that facilitates its own revision and allows us to engage in it without surrendering to it. That's the deep link of the problem that you bring up to the main themes that we've been discussing here.
Question here, and then our dear sister here.
Yeah, I'd just like to, if it's okay, to switch to foreign policy a little bit, specifically with our government and the Israeli government. Since the beginning of the Trump presidency, there's the big move of moving the embassy, U.S. embassy to Jerusalem. And then most recently, the plans of the government to take over the Golan Heights and to expand the Golan Heights. And I just want to talk about what's happening in our democracy right now with the Democratic Party, because something that's never happened before I think all but one of the Democratic candidates spoke there, or did not speak there, which was Booker. And progressives like Ilhan Omar, who's been actually like taking on this this debate and beginning the beat by the more established people in the Democratic Party, like Pelosi and Schumer. They decided to speak at the APAC conference. So there's kind of this like within the Democratic Party, there's a shift that's happening with progressives on this issue, because I believe that Palestine, Israel has been something that both Republicans and Democrats could always agree on for the most part. But it seems like there's starting to be a shift with progressives, but then you see people like Buttigieg, who's coming in and he's gaining a lot of popularity, but he's kind of taking the more establishment view on our relations with Israel. So I'm just curious, you know, what's happening with our democracy on this issue? What are the implications of us moving, or even having a tunnel of another discussion on this topic? And what should we be wary of? Because it seems like people like Buttigieg, who have a lot of progressive people or liberal people, are getting behind because of some of his identity markers and the things that he said, but then he's reverting back to this more establishment view. And so I'm just curious, like, general thoughts on that, and where that is going as our government is becoming more right-wing, and the Israeli government is more right-wing than it's been for many decades now.
No, I mean, you're right in terms of the very slow but inescapable glacier shift that's taking place, not just in the Democratic Party, but in the discourse in the United States, of the relation between the United States and the State of Israel. That's part of the intellectual and moral awakening that's taking place, again, disproportionately among young folk, and increasingly among young Jewish brothers and sisters. I've been blessed to march with them in front of the AIPAC convention 2 years ago. If not now, and a whole host of other young Jewish brothers and sisters who are upset with their mothers and fathers and grandmothers and grandfathers in terms of not telling them the truth about what's been going on in the last 100 years, but specifically 1948, 1967, 1973. For so long, it's been a taboo issue that even to raise the issue would be viewed as an anti-Semite on the way to supporting Hitler and so forth and so on. And that's not an issue to play with. We got 2,000 years of the hating of Jewish brothers and sisters. And it cuts very deep, not just in Western civilization, but it cuts very deep in Islamic civilization. It cuts very deep in other parts of the world. So a Jewish hatred is something that one should never, ever play with. It ought to be non-negotiable in terms of keeping track of the humanity of Jewish brothers and sisters. But at the same time, Jewish brothers and sisters are human beings, which means they can become oppressors like anybody else, you see. So if in fact you have an occupation, if in fact you have an annexation, if in fact you have subordination, if in fact you got demonization, then the hatred of Palestinians within Israel, especially the Israeli right, needs to be opposed as intensely as the hatred of Jews anywhere. And so the question more and more in the United States is breaking that kind of silence and taboo. And that's exactly what's been happening on the outside, and now the power and pressure is being brought to bear on the Democratic Party. Now, of course, ironically, it's the secular Jewish brother from Brooklyn, Brother Bernie Sanders, who's been most open to it, trying to be morally consistent. That's what he did when he asked 5 of us to be on the platform committee, especially Brother James Zogby and the 4 others of us, to raise this issue. And it's spilling over. And Sister Omar, who's been very, very courageous on this, who can argue about what words she uses and so forth. We're waiting for AOC to be even more progressive on this. She's progressive on so many other issues. And there's a tendency among progressives in the United States to be highly progressive on a host of issues. But when it comes to this issue, they get scared again. Oh, they don't want to be viewed as anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish. That's a good impulse. It's true. I mean, anybody who falls into the vicious pit of hating our Jewish brothers and sisters needs to be radically called into question. But that should never be an excuse to lose sight of the humanity of Palestinians. That should never be an excuse to downplay just how ugly the occupation is. And the fact that Donald Trump did exactly what many Democratic presidential candidates and presidents said. Obama was the one who stood there and said, it should be in Jerusalem. Then when he got in office, he slowly pulled back, but still increased the economic support for Israel. And Trump is just, just gangster on steroids. So he's just going to do what he believes. If I say we're going to do it, I wake up in the morning, they ought to just annex West Golan Heights. Call them up and do it. I don't need a dialogue. I just felt that's a good thing to do. I had a history lesson. It took about 30 seconds. That's what it said. So, I mean, he is honest, right-wing, authoritarian populist with neo-fascist sensibilities. So he rips the veil off and says, now what's going on in Israel now? They name a town after Trump. Now that's going to be hard on Jewish progressives. You want to be on cutting edge all the issues. You got to be honest about your own right wing. And everybody has that. Women got to be honest about their own right wing. Black folk got to be honest about their own right wing. Brown folk had to be honest across the board. But it's a slow shift. Now, we argued just to use the word occupation. We were voted down. No, that's ideologically charged. No, that's Veritas. That's the truth. Edward Said and I had marched in front of the New York Times in 1982 with the invasion of Lebanon to get them to use the word occupation. It took them almost 20 years to use the word. It's because they're scared. And they're scared in part because they don't want to be, tarred with that brush. And as I said, I think that's an important sense. No one ought to be tarred with that brush, but you never use that brush to move forward. And that's what's happening right now. The Democratic Party is under immense pressure to try to tell the truth about the misery taking place, especially in the occupation, and especially in right-wing movements, you see. And same is true with the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. We just had a dialogue with Brother Omar, trying to make sure you don't fall into any ugly Jewish-hating traps, as it were, but also trying to tell the truth about the nature of the relation between the American empire and right-wing forces in the state of Israel.
Bernie Sanders been explicit about what he wanted to do about this? Take office?
We working, praying for him. He's in movement. He's in movement, very much so. But I tell Bernie, quite honestly, you got to be yourself, man. You be yourself. Same is true of reparation. You got to be yourself. I got my view. You got your view. I'm going to put pressure on you. You put pressure on me. But whatever you say in public, speak from your heart and soul. See, a lot of these politicians just check and see what the polls say, and then they have a deep view about things. Well, you see, that's what you don't want. Because this is a very serious issue. There's people suffering. There's people who are worried about security. Jews worried about security given the 2,000 years. Palestinians worried about security and justice at the same time. These are very delicate issues. But we have to have the same urgency that we would have if there were a Palestinian occupation of our precious Jewish brothers and sisters. And we know in the history of America, if there were a Palestinian occupation of Jews, there'd be a qualitatively different response. And that's what upsets me. That's the double standard. Those Palestinian babies have exactly the same value as those precious Jewish babies. And we ought to be honest and consistent in that regard. And that's one of the points that Bernie does make. He wants what he calls an even-handedness that keep track of the humanity of both. I call it a double love affair. I do. I think we ought to be in love with Jewish brothers and sisters. We ought to be in love with Palestinian brothers and sisters. And the question is, what kind of tightrope can you walk in that regard? That's the legacy of a Martin King. That's the legacy of a Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. Because Rabbi Joshua Heschel was a progressive Zionist. I'm not a Zionist. I'm critical of nationalism, so we talked about that before. But Heschel also is the same person who can walk into a lecture in April 1948 and have tears in his eyes when the Jewish Irgun, the terrorist group of Jewish brothers and sisters, kill Arab children and women and men. And says, I refuse to lecture at Jewish Theological Seminary because those Arabs have exactly the same value as my Jewish brothers and sisters. And he walks off. And he remains the most unpopular professor at Jewish Theological Seminary in 1948. And what does he say? I don't care. Kiss my Jewish, well, he didn't say that. That's my black addition to it. When he said, kiss my Jewish so-and-so, I'm trying to be a decent person with moral integrity that goes back to the legacy of Amos and Esther and Jeremiah. Well, you see, that's the kind of voice we need, because you can be honest about this thing and come down in a different space. But at least you're concerned about the suffering and not rendering the misery invisible, you see.
And I did want to add just this last part about the progressive Jewish community in the U.S.
Yes.
Because, you know, in the research that I've done,
Jewish Voices for Peace and so forth.
yeah, this is not a new phenomenon.
That's right.
The first anti-Zionist organization in the country was actually a Jewish one. It started in the 30s, and so they have a very long legacy of fighting against an exclusive state. They wanted to have a lot of the solutions that progressive people like Marco Marco, your friend, proposed, that there were one state, democratic state where people live equally. But this idea is actually not new. And the Jewish community, going back to the 20s and the 30s, was fiercely, like the American Reform Jews were actually very strongly against Zionism. So it's not something that is new. What is new with the Jewish population in America is doing now, if it's been happening since decades before the creation of Israel?
Well, one is in 1967 and 1973. Well, our precious Jewish brothers and sisters once again felt as if they were in the world all by themselves with no allies. And it helped wake up a number of the Jewish brothers and sisters in the diaspora, especially those who were no longer underdogs and middle dogs, but some of the few top dogs, Jewish elites, you see. And they began to work through their Jewish identity in terms of an uncritical support of Israel because of the fear of annihilation. That's why the issue of Jewish security is very, very important indeed. But you're absolutely right. Within Israel itself, Albert Einstein, Judah Magnus, Ahak Aham, all of these folk were calling for coexistence. It was Jabotinsky who was calling for domination and ethnic cleansing. So you had this deep ideological battle going on within Israel and within the Jewish community. And that debate was much more intense than it is within the Jewish American community. And the Jewish American community also is wrestling with their own survival guilt, because so many of them are living so well in the new world and refuse to go back, but can send their monies as a way of working through their sense of Jewish belonging. Well, I don't want to go on and on about this, but this is important in terms of the relation of an American empire with this particular nation state. We got a whole host of other nation states that we could talk about, because there's other occupations, the Western Sahara under Morocco and Tibet and Kashmir. All of these need to be talked about with the same moral consistency and the same critique of the occupation where precious folk are subordinated. We got a question? Mm-hmm.
As an artist and designer, I'm very interested and passionate about how symbols and iconographies visually translate ideologies, value systems, identities. So I am looking at the Great Seals of America and many U.S. departments, and they show an eagle holding an olive branch on one hand and arrows on the other hand. So the symbol of that, the symbolism of that seal is that if you want peace, get ready for war. And I think that's a very violent message, to be honest. And I know that pretty much all nation states kind of operate with that. And I'm curious, how are we supposed to reform and correct and do all of these things while the symbols and the seals and monuments and all these things out in the public domain, seen or unseen, are still dominating the way that we're supposed to operate. And I don't see U.S. changing their seal really ever. And I don't see them, they're picking down monuments. But how are these progressive ideas going to thrive when, when we're going to look at the seal to find some sort of meaning, and we hear, well, if you want peace, get ready for war. And that's the type of attitude that
Mm-hmm. Did you want to say a
No,
word
you
about
begin.
that?
You begin, I'll say something.
Well, I'm glad you reminded us. I haven't looked at the seal for decades. But what you say is very real. See, when I see the eagle that is in the sermon of the great Reverend C.L. Franklin, genius himself, who was the father of Aretha Franklin, genius herself. The eagle stirs his nest. And in that particular sermon, it's a critique of the American seal. It's the way in which that American seal has led toward the subordination of peoples and the ways in which it has dominated and exploited peoples. But he still uses the eagle. It's like King using I Have a Dream. His dream is not the American dream at all. He said it's rooted in the American dream. It's a dialectic critique of the American dream. It wants the same energy, vitality, vibrancy, ingenuity that Brother Roberto talked about in regard to American culture. But he wants to filter it through moral and spiritual channels. You see, he wants the same courage that you get from those soldiers from West Point. And what is the difference between West Point and Harvard in terms of its subculture? I've been blessed to lecture at West Point. I was surprised they asked me. But they got a martial spirit, and they're ready to live and die for something. It just happens to be American Imperial ends. They still got courage. Harvard students, at our worst, not martial at all. It's commercial. It's market driven. It's hard to know what Harvard students would live and die for. I don't see them running to join the army. And if there were a draft, there'd probably be an anti-war movement at Harvard. Not led by the students, led by the parents of the students. My child's too precious because she's so smart. They're not going to fight in Afghanistan. Then what do you think working class kids are? Let them fight, but you don't want to fight because you're so smart and you're at Harvard? Martial spirit, West Point, eagle. How do you take the martial spirit of fighting on a battlefield that is moral, political, spiritual, fighting poverty, fighting racism, fighting sexism, fighting homophobia, and so forth and so on, you see. So there is a very fascinating, I think, complicated relation between those two. And there's ways in which oppressed people have been able to creatively appropriate some of these symbols and use the symbols over against the deployments of the dominant people who use the symbol. You see the point I'm making? But I mean, I have...
So Cornell, let me
yes.
just continue that and say to open our discussion to do justice to what you always emphasize, which is the tragic element in history.
Yeah, absolutely.
We have to recognize two facts. So one fact is that the national difference, the division of the world into sovereign states, is still necessary to humanity. We have not yet been able to dispense with it. Humanity develops its powers and potential only by developing them in different directions in the form of these states, and these states must then shield these experiments in ways of being human. And they must defend themselves. So I come from a country which has almost no experience of war for the last 150 years, and is skeptical of having any military force. But I think we don't want to live in a world in which only the meek and the peaceful are unarmed, and everyone else is armed to the teeth. So that that we have to be able to say no, and to say no, we have to be able to defend ourselves, and that is a universal imperative of these nation states. And for the moment, there's no way out of that, and that's this tragic element, which results at any moment in the possibility of war in the world. Now we come to the second tragic element, which is this. The most total war that we've had in human history was the Second World War. In the Second World War, rates of suicide and depression fell precipitously in all of the belligerent powers. Even in Soviet Russia, where 21, 22 million people died. So this is remarkable. And as soon as universal peace was reestablished, the rates of suicide and depression rose again. So this says something remarkable about us, that, as Cornell just said, there was terrible suffering in this war. But nevertheless, people felt lifted out of themselves and were able to forget themselves. So they stopped killing themselves, even though they were slaughtering one another across these national frontiers. So that it shouldn't be the case that we can be awake only when we're at war. And that we should find this other way to be drawn into a larger life. And so this is another tragedy in our experience, but it's a tragedy that is connected to something hopeful, which is this vocation of the human being to live for something bigger than himself, and that he can only really find some direction in this experience. So in a way, all of these arguments that we're having here in the course touch on that other tragic element of experience as well, which is finding that what William James called the moral equivalent to war, and we had the economic discussion of a war economy without a war, in which we can be mobilized, we can be uplifted without this actual experience of slaughter. And so somehow our reflections on all of these experiences have to confront these tragic elements in our experience. We can't evade them.
Absolutely.
Now,
and
Cornell,
keep in mind, though, the tragic is not the same as the pathetic. The pathetic is a perception of ourselves as victims. The tragic's about freedom, but it's always freedom under constraints. It's about freedom to push, what Plato called anange, to push the limits. And in that sense, it's accenting the dignity and sense of possibility of we linguistically conscious primates. Because that's really what we are. We're primates with language. Just a little different from the bonobos and the chimpanzees. And yet at the same time, when we're tied to something bigger than ourselves, with a creativity, with a compassion, lo and behold, great breakthroughs come through.
Cornell, our time has come relentlessly to an end.
Okay, all right.
And it makes me sad. So maybe you could say something.
No, I don't want you to feel sad.
I'm
brother.
too sad to say anything.
No, but the thing is, we're coming back next year stronger than ever. We thank you all for being a part of this journey. And it's been magnificent, magnificent. And to be able to work with this dear brother Roberto, who I love so deeply and respect so much. So you all stay strong in your life. And never forget about Martin Kelson. His spirit is here. His spirit is here. Stay strong, indeed, indeed.
Can I talk to you for a second? Just negotiating.